Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Susan, and welcome, yes, to the talk show here at the 92nd Street Y. We have an extraordinarily interesting and charming guest, the very new, freshly minted president of Harvard University, Larry Bacow. You know, I would like to just start with an anecdote about Larry Bacow. We can talk more about his background, but in there, about 10 minutes ago, knowing that my daughter was a graduate, he asked me, of Harvard, asked me how she's doing. And just as I was about to tell him, he said, let's call her up. And he said, let's FaceTime her. So there she was. He even knew how to trick her. It was my face first, and she's eating dinner, and then I said, there's a friend of yours who wants to talk to you. And then he grabbed the phone, and she dropped her spoon. So she wanted him to know that she had been to the Harvard-Yale game this year, and she's been back, and and I can assure you, she's telling everybody right now that this happened.
And so are you.
Yes, and I did. Well, because I was extremely moved by that, so thank you, Larry. Harvard is more than a university. It's a marquee brand. In this part of New York City, we would call it the New York Yankees, which means that there's a different...
Coming from Boston, I'll forgive you.
Yes, okay. I knew you were going to come back with that. But I would say that although you were the president at Tufts for a decade, and you really, as I said in our office, that you brought Tufts to a place it had not been before, and did such an extraordinary job that all of a sudden everybody was interested in who's this Larry Bacow, and you ended up being the president of Harvard. But is there truly something special about the experience of being the president of Harvard that is fundamentally different than Tufts? And are you enjoying this difference?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming tonight. I always say nobody springs from the womb expecting to be president of Harvard. It's a bit of an out-of-body experience. Fundamentally, the job is not that different from being president of Tufts. The biggest difference between the two is that the job is much more visible than it was being president of Tufts. You know, I was recognizable on the Tufts campus and in and around Medford and Boston a little bit, but there's a lot more interest in Harvard and the president of Harvard for reasons that sometimes escape me. So that's, I would tell you, the biggest difference.
And it is true. I mean, you know, even for Yale graduates, if you're here, Harvard does elicit, as a Harvard parent at one point in my life, I have to tell you, I got tired of the reactions, you know? It's like, where did your daughter go to school? Somewhere in Boston. Yeah. Because people reacted differently.
And so, Harvard, we call that dropping the H-bomb.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I know. I just realized it suggests something that it has a kind of mystique, and it has an effect on people. And yet, there are many fine universities in the United States, but Harvard seems to elicit a different response. Now, what many people don't know about you, and it's something that I know about you because we share this in common, and we've talked about this before, we're both children of Holocaust survivors. Your mother is an Auschwitz survivor. And I want you to speak, if you can, I'm sure you have in the past, the sense of this being the American miracle of a woman who, as a teenager, leaves Auschwitz, ends up in the United States, and her child, born in the United States, not two generations, not a grandchild, not a great-grandchild, the child becomes the president of Harvard. It is a miracle of America.
Right. Yeah, it is. I mean, I feel incredibly blessed. I feel like I've had the privilege of living the American dream. My mother was the only member of her family who survived, the only Jew from her town who survived the war. She came to this country on the second Liberty ship that brought refugees from Europe, landed at the Brooklyn Naval Yard, because if you came as a refugee back then on a troop ship, you didn't come through Ellis Island. You came through the Brooklyn Naval Yard. My father was also an immigrant and also a refugee. He was born in Minsk, but he came before the war. So, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm as committed to higher education as I am is traditionally it has been the enabler of the American dream. And I think for those of us who've been so fortunate to benefit from the opportunity that's provided by colleges and universities. And there, as you say, there are many great ones throughout this country. You know, I feel like it's important that we work to ensure that there's opportunity for the next generation, just as it was made available to so many of us. And that is what, in fact, motivates me.
But you mentioned something to me earlier that I think most people surely don't know, which was that since you had been at Harvard before you became president, there were offers made to you to become president, and in earlier times, it didn't interest you as much, but in fact, the events of Charlottesville was one of the things that changed your mind to actually take on, to enter into the role of the presidency of Harvard.
Well, I should correct the record slightly. I mean, I had been asked if I was interested, and people had suggested, and I said, no, you know, been there, done that, and I thought I was done as a university president. But a number of things changed, and one of them was Charlottesville. And for me, it was, as the son of a survivor, to witness people carrying torches and marching and saying blood and soil and Jews will not replace us, and wearing Nazi symbols and white supremacists. This is not the America that I know, and this is one of the great college towns in America as well, you know, town of Thomas Jefferson. And it just struck me that this was not a time for this reason and for others to be sitting on the sideline. In fact, my wife Adele and I had a conversation about it, and we were talking, and literally we said, you know, we hope it doesn't come to this, but if someday our children or our grandchildren ask us, what were we doing when all of this was happening in this country? We didn't want to say we were just sitting on the sidelines. This was a time when I think people really need to engage, and it's all of our responsibility, I would tell you, as citizens.
So, what is it like to be the president of Harvard, the world's best-known university, in an age of Trump? Now, my purpose here is not to be critical of this president. I'm just saying that there is an atmosphere around us that's been created, and it's global in some extent, right? So it's not just here, but it's here. And when you mentioned Charlottesville, that introduced that idea. And this is it's an era in which there's an assault on the truth. I think I read somewhere you called it a post-factual world. It's an attack on knowledge itself. I mean, you're in the knowledge-giving business, and there's an attack on knowledge. Knowledge in this era seems to be suspect. Fake news, fake science, climate deniers, climate change deniers, fake ideas. I wonder whether this presents a whole new set of challenges, because I can't think of a time in American history where there was an actual attack on the university, higher education itself.
So I think it is unusual in our history. I think it's, you know, as I like to say, our symbol is veritas, truth. So we do stand for truth in a post-factual world. But it's more than just an attack on truth and knowledge. We're the definition of elite at a time in which that's become a bad word when applied to almost anything other than a quarterback. We also are arguably among the most global of institutions at a time of America First. So we're swimming against a lot of tides. And you know, I think it's important that we speak, and that I speak to the enduring values of higher education as enablers of opportunity, that we must defend the concept not of elitism, but of excellence. And that's what I think we really stand for. That it's important that we speak to the value of a liberal education, the capacity to be able to distinguish the signal from the noise, at precisely the time that people are espousing all sorts of different theories that are not grounded in knowledge and fact. And I think that it's important also that we distinguish facts from truth. You know, facts are incontrovertible, or at least they should be. But truth is something that needs to be understood. It has to be uncovered, discovered, tested on the anvil of ideas. which I think also imposes an obligation upon academic institutions to make sure that we are always open to ideas from across the ideological spectrum. We have to be willing to encourage and embrace people who are willing to challenge us and to challenge conventional wisdom. So I think, that imposes some responsibilities on us, especially at a time when so much is contested right now. We ought to be the kind of place where people can come and wrestle with big ideas, to marshal evidence, to disagree, but to do so civilly. That's what a university is all about.
Do you feel sanguine, hopeful, that when you say this contest, this clash, that you can win it? And I mean that because, in some ways, it's not a fair fight. Today, anyone with a cell phone and an internet connection and a Twitter account is an expert.
True.
And everyone can communicate their opinion and treat it as facts. People run with a tweet. I mean, they run. Even the news sometimes gets away from itself. It doesn't check anymore. And you come from a place of thoughtful, deliberate discussion and observation with oversight and checking. And so I wonder whether you look at yourself and say, look, I may be at Harvard, but the overwhelming numbers of people are relying on something else, and can I beat them at this?
But look, I think one has to be an optimist when it comes to this issue. We've been around for 383 years.
So this is what, 1636?
1636. Another way to think about that is on the day the Declaration of Independence was signed, we were 140 years old. It's striking when you think about it.
Right, that John Adams, when he was at Harvard, at the time of the signing of the Declaration, he thought that was an old university.
Well, it's older than Stanford is today, just to put it in context. So we're not going away. And we, I think, have to stand for something, and we have to stand for these values. And not just Harvard, but I think every academic institution stands for these values. We all choose different ways to express it in terms of mottos and things. I spent most of my career at MIT. Our motto was mens et manus, mind in hand. At Tufts, it was pax et lux, peace and light. But the idea is the same, that all of our institutions exist to try and generate new knowledge, to help use that knowledge to benefit mankind, and to educate the next generation. And I think it's now more important than ever that we educate the next generation so that they are capable of sifting through vast quantities of information. Notice I didn't say facts. And to be able to figure out what is worthy of belief, what needs to be tested, what needs to be contested. That's why we exist.
Let's go back to the point that you made about elitism. Yes, there is Harvard as a marquee name, is in the Ivy League, and many people would say it's the best known of the Ivy League schools. And there is always a sense of elitism about Harvard. But we're also living in an era in which there's an attack against the elite, the liberal elite, specifically blue state liberal elite. And I can't think of any institution that would be associated with that than Harvard. Now, on the one hand, those people who respond this way do so out of their own feelings of resentment, of having been left behind, or feeling uncared for, or forgotten, right? I mean, we don't really, in my mind, and I did not vote for Donald Trump, but we're not thinking about what was the Trump voter thinking? Why is it that he knew when he said, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and my voters wouldn't even care? He knew this. Why did he know that the Access Hollywood tape wouldn't matter? He knew this. He knew this because he traveled the country and he heard resentment. And the resentment was directed at us, the kinds of people that would come to the 92nd Street Y to hear the president of Harvard. And I'm wondering, is there any way to address that other than admitting people from red states?
Well, we do admit people from red states, you know, plenty of them. The other thing I would point out is that, you know, people who think that we brainwash our students, I would say, if we're doing that, we're not doing a very good job of it. You know, there are 15 Harvard graduates currently serving in the United States Senate. 9 of them are Republicans, 6 of them are Democrats.
Wow.
If you take a look at the Supreme Court, I mean, you know, John Roberts is an alumnus of Harvard. Neil Gorsuch is an alumnus of Harvard. Brent Kavanaugh was teaching at Harvard. My point is that you'll find all sorts of views represented at Harvard and among Harvard alumni, not just from one side or the other. But I do think it's also important that we demonstrate to people why what happens at places like Harvard matters to the nation and not just to those who live on the coast. I'm from Pontiac, Michigan, and the first trip I took as president of Harvard was back to my hometown, and that was deliberate. Now, Pontiac is when I grew up, was a factory town, 3 General Motors plants. GM was well represented there, GM Truck and Coach, Fisher Body, Pontiac Motors. And there were 80,000 people living in Pontiac when I grew up. And you know, you could graduate from Pontiac Central High School on Friday and go to work for one of the automobile plants on Monday and be pretty much guaranteed a comfortable middle-class existence in which your kids would go to a good college if they went to college. In Michigan, they would graduate without debt because Michigan supported its public universities very, very well. And you would retire someday with a pension and benefits, and you know, you'd own your own house and maybe even a little cottage on a lake. That's all gone. You know, all 3 of the public schools I attended have closed. So I understand why people feel like they've been left behind. But when I went there, I also spoke in Detroit and pointed out that, you know, we have graduates of Harvard who are doing good work everywhere, including Detroit. Pointed out the president of Wayne State University, a big urban university in Detroit, was a graduate of our medical school. That the superintendent of public schools in the city of Detroit was a graduate of our ed school. That the chief planner for the city of Detroit was a graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. That the head of the United Way in southeastern Michigan was a graduate of Harvard College. And this story replicates itself throughout America. In every state of the union, you will find our graduates working to try and make their communities better. So I think we need to do a better job of pointing out the good work that our alumni are doing, and not just those who you know, have founded and created great companies and accumulated great wealth in the process. We have those too, and we're proud of those people as well, because they're creating economic opportunity. But we need to do a better job of explaining why our graduates are people who are working hard to make this a better place, as they've traditionally done.
So the story that many might assume is that you graduate from Harvard, you go straight to Goldman Sachs, is partially true, but not entirely true. That
Your daughter's not doing that.
Exactly, she's not doing it. She's at the think tank. That's quite right. But I'm saying it is interesting to think about how Harvard can get lumped in to this liberal elite when, in fact, I was just at graduation last year, and we'll talk about this in a moment. The extraordinary multicultural diversity, that the look, the opticality of Harvard just completely, you know, undermines any thought that this is the Harvard of the 18th century or the early 20th century.
Well, also, we've worked hard to ensure that Harvard's accessible to students, regardless of the ability of their families to pay. I actually had this conversation just recently with Senator Grassley and pointed out to him that, you know, there were 23 kids from Iowa at Harvard College, 19 of whom were on financial aid, and that the average financial aid award for those students was sufficiently large that what they paid, what their families paid to attend Harvard was actually less than what they would pay as in-state students to attend the University of Iowa.
Wow.
So, you know, we try to make sure that students and their parents, you know, if kids can do the work and get accepted, you know, we'll make sure that they can attend Harvard regardless of the capacity of their parents to write a check for anything. If you earn less than $65,000 a year, your family pays nothing to attend Harvard.
Let's go to a different area, something that's it's personal to me. I happen to be a novelist. I'm also a law professor. And because of that, I worry about living in an age in which the value of a liberal arts education is being devalued. And we're being told that your children should learn how to program computers, that the term of art STEM is in everybody's mind, right? It's science, technology, engineering, and math. And that those in the humanities, right, the value of just reading novels and being an English major, that is being considered not a serious effort for 4 years, not something one should spend their time on. And I'm wondering, Harvard's humanities program is among the best, if not the best, and is this something that we should be thinking about? Is there a balance that we're trying to achieve? Now, you were at MIT at a different point. It may have been true that at one point, the STEM students really were the minority. And
not at MIT.
Not at MIT, right. So you would be the only one, that would be the only school, that in Caltech. But I'm wondering whether we should see this also as a challenge to the value of a liberal arts education that is not directed towards math, computers, and science.
Well, it's a good question. I've actually been having a lot of conversations recently with people who run major tech companies. And what's interesting is that they've become very, very interested in questions of ethics and philosophy these days, in part because they realize that they ignore them at their peril. All you have to do is pick up a paper and read about what's going on with Facebook, Google. What are the revealed preferences of algorithms that we're all using to navigate our way around the world or to find information. And I think that as more and more decisions in life are going to be made by machines, I think people are starting to ask, what does it mean to be human in such a world? And so, if you think about it, I think many of the biggest questions which we confront as a society are not going to be answered by scientists or engineers. I mean, take climate change. The science of climate change is settled at this point. The debate about climate change is really about what are the responsibilities of one generation to future generations. How much are we going to consume and leave for others? Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. What sacrifices are we going to make today in order to ensure that they can have a reasonable chance at a reasonable life in the future? That's an ethical question. That's a philosophical question. That's not a question that's grounded in science or engineering or mathematics. If you look at what's happening around the world about the rise of populism, I mean, those issues are not going to be addressed by folks who are, fundamentally studying, STEM fields. I don't mean to argue against studying science, engineering, or mathematics. To the contrary, but these are issues which are grounded in what does it mean to be a community. What does it mean to be part of a political process? How are we as a society going to make decisions about certain things? You look around the world, one of the things which is tearing the world apart is the tension between fundamentalism and modernity. And it exists not just in the Middle East, it exists in the United States at the moment. Okay? Scholars of religion who have something to say about that. So I think that we ignore the humanities at our peril, and I actually think that there's going to be an increasing interest in what humanists and others have to say, because it has direct bearing on how we are going to address some of the most fundamental issues which are tearing at the fabric of our society today. And I didn't even get into issues of race and class and gender.
So clearly, no Harvard guidance counselor says to a budding philosophy or English major, you really should be taking math. I mean, that's just simply not what happens, which is good to know as a novelist.
I certainly hope not. But I do think, however, let me add, that one of the things that has moved more and more students to view their education in a utilitarian way and to think about just the present value of the future earnings is the increasing real cost of an education. Education is both investment and consumption.
Right.
You know, we study some things because they're going to equip us financially. There's a financial return, but we study other things because they're going to help us lead a better, more interesting life and to understand and appreciate the world that we live in ways that other things don't. That they help us to understand why life is actually worth living, and that's the humanities.
I've read or heard you say before that to you, higher education is just a function of better citizenship. That is, it is essential to citizenship, to what it means to be a citizen. And people usually don't speak in those terms, right? They think of college as the next step onto a career. But to think of it in civic terms is a very different way of thinking. I'm wondering whether, is this an original idea? Would we say most college presidents would have felt the same way?
I think if you go back and if you read why Thomas Jefferson established the University of Virginia, why Benjamin Franklin established the University of Pennsylvania, in large part it was to educate citizens for a democracy. It is one of the fundamental reasons why we have traditionally embraced higher education and supported it as we have. And God help us if we think that our democracy does not need educated citizens. In fact, I would argue that we need them now more than ever. And so I think it's important to stress this to students. When I welcomed first-year students at Harvard this year, our entering freshman class, I made a point of giving them their first homework assignment. I said, here it goes. If you're eligible to vote in the United States, I expect you to register, inform yourself of the candidates and the issues, and to cast a ballot. Because with education comes responsibility. And that's true, I think, for everybody who's fortunate and privileged to be able to get an education.
Let's talk a little about the immigration debate. I know this is important to you because from your perspective, your parents were immigrants, and Harvard is really an example of an immigration story itself.
Yes. So, it is personal for me. I remember my mother talking about how hard it was to get out of Germany after World War II, and literally walking to the border to see if she could get out, first at one border and then another. So we are a nation of immigrants, but more than that, we live in a world in which the only truly scarce capital is human capital. Financial capital moves at the speed of light. It's no longer necessary for nations or regions to be well endowed with natural resources to be wealthy. It's their ability to be able to aggregate and concentrate and develop human and intellectual capital. And that is what colleges and universities do. In many cases, the rest of the world sends us their best and their brightest. We should welcome these people who want to come here and study here. Many will go back to their countries and enrich their countries with what they've learned in the States, and that's terrific. But many of them will want to stay. 35% of the Harvard faculty were born someplace else. 50% of the PhDs given in engineering and mathematics in the United States are given to foreign nationals. I was just looking at the numbers recently. 40% of the Nobel Prizes awarded in the sciences awarded to U.S. citizens over the last, 30 years or so, went to U.S. citizens who were born someplace else. And so the history of this country is that we have encouraged people to come here and given them opportunity. And in fact, most of us, unless we're Native American or we were brought here, our ancestors were brought here against their will as slaves, most of us know the story of our ancestors who came here either in search of freedom or opportunity. And I think it's important that we continue to give people those opportunities going forward.
Now, I know you're proud of Harvard's diversity, the pluralism of the university itself. I'm going to tell you an anecdote that you probably don't know, but people at the Y know, because once I had Larry Summers sitting in that seat. And Larry told this anecdote. I'm curious what you would say about it. He said that occasionally he goes down to the admissions office to see what's going on down there. He says, I don't interfere. I just walk around. I was there on a day where he called it I don't know what it's called, like a kind of group of them where they just discuss applicants.
It's all done in committee.
Right, committee.
By 40 people.
Right. So
one person, one vote.
So they're all sitting around.
And every applicant.
They're actually, right, and they're actually talking about this one particular student who the president of the university just walked in on. And I remember Larry Summers saying, he said, had good scores, good grades, but since he was 6 years old, he comes from New York, his parents used to tutor him in Mandarin. And by the time he was in high school, they paid for a tutor. And by the time that he was in high school, he spent 3 summers living in Beijing. So he was essentially Chinese. And that was so incredibly distinctive about him. And then he went back upstairs and he found out, he said at some future point, he found out, he said, I knew what I thought I should have done, that I thought we should have admitted him. And he discovered that eventually they did. But then he said he had second thoughts. And he said, well, I have to ask myself, we just admitted someone whose parents could afford to give someone Mandarin lessons from the age of 6. And what an astonishingly unfair advantage that was on a resume, because no inner city kid could ever say they were fluent in Mandarin, and how fundamentally unfair that would be. So I wonder how, with the pluralism that I see, the diversity within Harvard, how is that achieved?
Well, first of all, I think the Dean of Admissions has a much harder job than I do. We get 44,000 applications, and out of that, he's got to select a class of 1,600 students. We admit about 2,000 to get 1,600, but still, it's an impossible job. And in fairness, I always tell people admissions is above my pay grade. I try and stay as far away from it as I can. Although I did, like Larry did, I sat in on the process just so that I could understand mechanically how it's done. While we admit individual students, we also try to admit a class. And we're cognizant of what the class in total looks like in the aggregate. Why? Because we learn from our differences. Harvard would be a very dull place, as would any university, if every student spent 3 summers in Beijing and studied Chinese. Or alternatively, if every student came from Pontiac, Michigan, with the same working class background. Let's say that wasn't me, but somebody else.
Although I suspect you would admit that there were decades in which that was true, right? That all of Harvard's class sort of came from the same background.
Well, it was actually, I spent my summer reading histories of Harvard, and that's a cartoon of Harvard.
That's not even true, even when you see all the white guys in suits.
Yeah, even back then, there were the kids who couldn't afford to live in certain places and literally had to clean toilets in order to be able to afford to attend Harvard. Harvard admitted those students as well. So not in the same proportion as we have the diversity that we have today, far from it, but there were always others represented. And back then, many more who came from, private high schools than we would find today. And geographically, not nearly as diverse as it is today, or ethnically as well, or socioeconomically. So in admitting a class, though, we are looking for a variety of different kinds of students with different interests, different backgrounds, different extracurricular, co-curricular activities. Why? Because students wind up learning at least as much from each other as they learn from the faculty. And I always say amazing things happen when you confine students and faculty together under temperature and pressure for 4 years. It is the value of this extraordinary residential experience, which students at many colleges and universities in the United States are fortunate to be able to enjoy. Not everybody does that, and you can get a great education anywhere. But if you are fortunate to do it, they're truly transformational things that happen at 2 o'clock in the morning in many college dormitories. And that's where you really do want to see diversity because people do learn from their differences.
Now, I hope you won't feel uncomfortable by the question, and I hope you're not barred by the lawsuit itself from addressing it. I can't help but think that some of you in the room may know or are aware of this Asian American lawsuit against Harvard. And by the way, I thought the quotes in the papers that I've been reading that you wrote were very thoughtful and very respectful. But when you're talking about diversity, the Asian American lawsuit is based on the idea that Asians are actually artificially underrepresented at Harvard, and that they deserve more spots than they receive. And they point to things like that are here in New York, for instance, which I think is about to change also. But that daughter that you just called, she went to a high school that had 75% Asian students, roughly 75%. Can you make the case for why Harvard is everything that you said, diverse, and also fair at the same time?
Sure. So first of all, you need to understand that we could, of the 43,000 applicants, we could admit an entire class with perfect grades and perfect SAT scores. And we could do that multiple times over. So grades,
you're saying there's an entire class of people are perfect on grades and...
Yeah, we could do that. All right? So high grades and high SAT scores don't get you into Harvard. Something else has to distinguish things. And at some level, what the lawsuit is about more than anything else are those who say we should more heavily weight or only weight grades and SATs, and if we did so, the class would look different than it does today. I would also point out that for students who were so tightly bunched at the right tail of the distribution on grades and SATs, as they are for those who are applying to Harvard, that the difference between somebody who's got 790 on their SATs and somebody who has 800, that's not a meaningful difference. And not only that, but as you just pointed out, the student who may have not 790, but may have 720, may be a more interesting student because they may have learned English in the 9th grade and didn't have the benefit of parents who were able to ensure that they had tutors and access to the best schools and the greatest opportunities. So even if you take a look at, quote, objective measures, no two students are alike because they, in many cases, have started off in different places. And then to that, I always say to people, and we could take a poll here, if you've ever hired anybody, how many people have ever hired somebody without checking their references, without asking about their work experience, without looking at their work product? Why don't we just hire people based upon their grades? Because most of us we're more than our numbers, and nobody wants to be judged just on their numbers alone. And so, especially when we're constructing a class, we want people who represent all sorts of different backgrounds and interests, and we take a broad view of what constitutes merit, and not a very, narrow view. And that, in the end, that's what the lawsuit is about. There was an important point at the end of the opening argument in the lawsuit. And by the way, we're only doing what the Supreme Court has said on multiple occasions we can do. 2 out of the last 3 cases that went to the Supreme Court cited our admissions process specifically as sort of the gold standard for how one can consider race as one factor among many in college admissions. And nothing that came out in the facts in the lawsuit disputed what we were doing what the court said we could do. But at the end of the opening argument, our Bill Lee, who was trying the case for us and who happens to be Asian American himself and is a senior fellow of the Harvard Corporation, a very good trial lawyer. At the end, Bill paused and said, "Your Honor, if I may make a personal observation." He said, "I remember trying my very first case in federal district court here in Boston over 40 years ago. At that time, on that date, there was one woman in the courtroom. That was the court reporter. I was the only person of color in the courtroom on that day. And then he paused and he said, Your Honor, by the way, before Judge Allison Burroughs, female judge, look at this courtroom today. This courtroom looks different because of the work of Harvard and institutions like Harvard, who've worked to ensure that there is opportunity for students from all backgrounds and to ensure that we now reflect the diversity of our nation. That is what is at stake in this lawsuit. And I think it was an eloquent statement about what we try to do, not just Harvard, but every college and university through admissions.
Where do you think the direction of higher education is going? Do you think that it'll change in some fundamental way? Will Harvard be at the forefront of that? You know, there are still colleges, Columbia I think being one of them, University of Chicago being one of them, that insist that their first-year students take a kind of core curriculum where they read largely the ancient Greeks and other works of classic literature. 25, 30 years ago, there started to become a movement that said, well, we shouldn't just be reading the works of dead white Greeks, that we should be able to read also the works of people of color. Harvard, I don't exactly know where was in this debate, but there's always been this sort of thinking about how can we transform what higher education looks like, what students are expected to do and to read, and how they even learn, right? Because I think Summers, when he was here, said the word, I think he said collaborative learning. He felt strongly that that was something, was an area that it was headed.
So one of the great strengths of American higher education is the diversity of institutions, and that we don't all approach it in the same way. And as a result, we compete for students, we compete for faculty, we compete for resources. That competition, I think, makes us all better. So, you know, Columbia does it one way, MIT does it another way, Harvard does it another way, CUNY does it another way, SUNY does it yet another way, and even among the SUNY campuses and among the CUNY pieces, each one is specialized and approaches education in a slightly different way. I think that's enormously valuable. One size does not fit all. We don't try and do it that way in this country. And, everybody's sort of watching what everybody else does. And I always say, I'll steal a good idea anywhere I can find it. And if there are institutions that have demonstrated that they've got a more effective way at educating their students, we'll look at that, try and take it and improve upon it. So I don't think there's one approach. And in fact, I think that the strength of higher education writ large in the country is the fact that we have so many different types of institutions, each approaching education in a slightly different way.
What about the difference between American universities and European universities? There must have come a time when the European universities felt superior.
Well, in fact, if you look in pre-World War II Europe, or pre-World War II, and ask what were the leading research universities in the world, a good chunk of them were in Germany. Right. In fact, there was a reason why doctoral students in the United States had to study German, because it was the lingua franca of scholarship for generations, until it wasn't. So
the Holocaust clearly devastated academia in Germany. I remember, people may not remember that the New School downtown was basically started by Russian emigres. That's why Hannah Arendt was there, and Herbert Marcuse, I think, was there. So there was a tremendous drain of talent. And
if I can also note, sorry to interrupt, but a story that's not all that well known, the Rockefeller Foundation actually underwrote positions in U.S. universities for scholars who were escaping Nazi, not just Nazi Germany, but what became Nazi Europe at the time. And many of those became among the greatest scholars in American university of their time.
And teachers, because there was a documentary about this. that a number of them actually got their first jobs at black colleges in the South.
Yeah.
And so there was this incredible period of German emigres, sometimes Jewish, that were teaching African Americans at historically black institutions.
That story I did not know.
Yeah, no, that there was a wonderful documentary about that, and it was really about the relationship between these refugees and their African American students, and it was quite extraordinary. But do we see now a balance? Do you think that American universities overall is where learning really ought to be? The best research is coming out. You did tell us that a disproportionate number of immigrants are at universities in the United States winning Nobel Prizes and other prizes. But would we also say that in their departure, they've also actually left behind great universities that are not so great anymore?
Well, look, if you look at any ranking of the best universities in the world, the bulk of them are still in the United States, are in the United States. Our higher education system is the envy of the rest of the world. Most countries would give their eye teeth to have the university system that we enjoy in the United States. One of the great contributions, I think, of American higher education is that so many of the leaders of the great universities in other parts of the world were actually educated in American universities.
Right.
And so I think part of this is our mission, is to help, through education, lift up others from around the world, not just in the United States. And I think traditionally, American higher education has done that. There's a tremendous amount of exchange between institutions. It's also the case, though, that at a time in which, candidly, especially the states are disinvesting in their support of the great state universities in this country, countries abroad are investing in their public institutions. And we should never forget, notwithstanding this fascination with Harvard and places like it, 4 out of 5 students in the United States are going to be educated at the great public universities. And we all have an interest in seeing that they are well supported.
Now, Harvard is, as you said, at the forefront of making it possible for students of lower income to attend. That's not, not everyone has Harvard's endowment, so that's
But we're not the only ones that
right.
are doing this. Many, many other institutions are doing it as well.
But you're confident that America does not need to be convinced that the case still needs to be made for higher education, even if it means big student loans. I think that this comes up where, I remember I was so surprised because President Obama had been the president of the Harvard Law Review. And so when people were talking about the cost of higher education, the cost of law school, at one point he said, well, we could make it 2 years, not 3. Yeah. And he introduced the idea of, well, let's just knock out one of the years. I'm wondering whether that from your perspective, the case should and always be made that it costs what it costs because it's worth what it's worth.
Well, I think we have to do more than that. I don't think we can just wave our hands and say that's the case. I happen to believe that it is worth the investment. In fact, the differential in lifetime earnings between a college graduate and a high school graduate has never been higher than it is right now. But that said, I also think that we need to spend a lot more time thinking hard about how we bend the cost curve in higher education. It is breathtakingly expensive. If we had more time, we could talk about why that's the case. It's one of the few industries where competition tends to drive costs up, not down. We could talk more about that.
Now, should we assume that part of it has to do with university professors?
No, actually.
That you have to recruit them. In order to recruit them, you have to give them things and give them higher salaries. It's not just that.
It's not just that. We know how to make higher education cheaper. It's not that difficult. It's called bigger classes. It's called less student-faculty contact. It's called less hands-on learning. It's called fewer curricular options. It's called simpler facilities, less support for co-curricular life. I could go on.
And you're saying this would just drop the tuition rates down?
Well, no, if we did all those things, we could lower the price. The problem is nobody wants that. And any of you who've ever taken a kid on a college tour, what do you ask when you go on the college tour? What's your student-faculty ratio? Well, you're looking for the most labor-intensive or most profligate consumer of labor among institutions around. You ask, You know, how many curricular options? What can my kids study? How big are the classes? More is always better than less. You know, what kind of student activities are? Show me what the dormitories look like. You know, it's a combination of things. And so it's the competition, actually, that drives costs up, not down in higher education.
You heard that here. That is an original thought that I think most people have never given much thought to. Before we take some questions from the audience, Larry, I want to know, tell us about the Yale-Harvard rivalry. I mean, we joked a moment ago about the Red Sox and the Yankees.
Yeah.
My daughter shared with you the fact that she came to the game. That was the
right.
You loved hearing that. That was good. Is this a healthy rivalry to have? It's historic. It's been here forever. Is there any actual enmity between the universities? So tell us about this, because it comes up all the time, and I was curious, how real is it?
How real is it? First
Do
of all,
you and the president of Yale hang out?
Oh, Peter and I get along very well. You know, you should know Peter Solovey is a descendant of Rabbi Soloveitchik.
Yeah, I knew that.
So I should note that, seeing that we're having this conversation at the 92nd Street Y.
It has meaning here.
Yeah. Right. So, look, I think that competition is healthy. I think competition is generally good. It's good-natured. You know, there's a football game once a year. Some years they win it. Some years we win it. There's, you know, competition for students.
You said you were 1-0.
I'm 1-0. Yeah. I had not, and I did not carry the football this year. We have faculty who have gotten their degrees at one place and teach at the other. Faculty who collaborate with each other. I mean, students who go back and forth at various times. Families that have sent kids to both places. Again, the United States is blessed with many, many great institutions, and Harvard and Yale are just but two of them. But there are lots and lots of others. And there are lots of other, you know, rivalries. Amherst and Williams, Michigan State, Michigan and Ohio State. I mean, I could go on. Most of these are, you know, very good-natured and fun until they get out of hand.
It's so nice to hear. It's so nice to hear you say that, because I don't know if the last talk show we did was with Frank Bruni and Brett Stevens.
Yeah.
And Frank Bruni wrote a book, I don't know if you remember, where he was talking about how we have undervalued the state university, and that we've
absolutely right.
Yeah, we have forced people to think that if you don't get into the Ivy League, you've missed out on something. And so he was the one that was sort of, he wrote a book, I forgot what it was, about it, does it matter which college I go to? And
I don't think we force people to think that you have to go to the Ivy League.
Well, you don't, but somebody.
I went to a small New England technical school on the Charles River. I did not go to Harvard or any other Ivy League college.
Yeah. All right, let's take some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
If I were a Blavatnik or a Chan or a Paulson and walk up for a 9-figure gift, are there circumstances where you say no? And does that change anything about the culture of Harvard?
All right.
We have said no to 9-figure gifts before. Absolutely, we have. You know.
And is it? Well, I'm just curious. No, because the student really doesn't merit
no,
it?
It wasn't an admissions question. I didn't understand it. What,
just the actual, the gift
just
itself.
naming gifts. You know.
Right, and naming gifts, but you weren't saying naming gifts from names of people that had disreputable names. You were just saying, have we ever turned a name down? Yes.
We have refused gifts in the past, and it depends upon what the gift is for, and it depends upon the relationship of the individual to the institution. The 3 people that you mentioned are all alumni who have had a long relationship and have been generous to the institution for many years, and they've just chosen to be more generous recently. But they're people that we have known forever, and they've known us forever, or at least back to their student days.
Yes, front row. Yes, you.
So moving to cultural institutions
question?
Yes, a little louder, please.
The question was about accepting gifts from the Sackler family. I think every institution needs to make their own decisions about who they accept gifts from and who they don't. We have the Sackler Museum at Harvard, which was donated. It was a gift from Arthur Sackler in the 1980s. He died not long after that and sold his interest in the business or the estate sold it to his brothers. OxyContin is developed years later. I don't have any problem with Mr. Sackler's name being on our museum. I think it is, Derek Bach actually wrote something about this. And he said...
This is an earlier president, right?
Right. And Derek was writing more generally. And he said, when we recognize a donor for a gift, we're not endorsing everything that they ever did in their life. It's not the same as actually giving an honorary degree to somebody. And I think actually, there's a lot of wisdom in that. So.
Yes.
You mentioned that Harvard's a champion of diversity. As you know, the education for a student coming from Baltimore, Maryland may be very different than education for a kid that goes to school in Westchester.
Mm-hmm.
You're both very committed. What kind of programs and what kind of standards do you guys have to make sure that both those students get through your curriculum and through your program?
Great.
Successfully?
Yeah, great question. I think institutions are today much more sensitive in trying to make sure that they don't think that the problem is solved when we admit students. That we're much more cognizant now about what we need to do in order to make sure that students actually thrive while they're there. So we do a number of things. We try to make sure that, for example, first-generation students, first kid in their family to go to college, are matched up with our best first-year advisors freshman year. In the past, people were randomly assigned. Not anymore. We run special pre-orientation programs for first-gen kids where they come in, and those programs are largely run by upperclassmen who are first-gen kids who talk about their own experiences and provide advice. We had an alumnus a couple of years back who had been the first generation in his family to go to college and then did phenomenally well in the world after he graduated. And said, one of the problems I had when I was a student, while my scholarship paid for my tuition and my books and my fees, when my classmates wanted to go into the square and get a hamburger, I couldn't afford to do that. And he actually provided a gift for what he called startup grants, sort of walking around money, if you will, for our neediest students. When I was at Tufts, one of the things which we did, and I'm going to try and do the same thing at Harvard, is we allocated financial aid so that our neediest students could go to summer school for one summer. Now, wealthy kids, if they're doing poorly in a class, will drop the class, okay? And they'll often take it over the summer to catch up. Or if they're going to medical school, they may take organic chemistry in the summer to lighten their load during the year and to focus on that. Poor kids can't afford to do that. So what we tried to do is to say, here, we're going to give you the opportunity to go to summer school, again, to try and level the playing field. So I think there are a variety of things which we can and which we need to do.
I wonder if you can address, and then we'll see, maybe you'll say goodnight to the president of Harvard University, Larry Bacow. I'm going to leave us on a question that many people are wondering about when they send their kids off to school or when they read newspapers of things that are happening on campuses. Safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings, the shouting down of speakers that students don't like, the disinvitation to people who have written a controversial book or associated with a right-wing thinking. We see this in the last several years. That Berkeley has been hit by this a lot. We've seen, I remember years ago, I had as a guest here, love this comeback story. Brandeis had disinvited Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and then we had then invited Ayaan Hirsi Ali here. She was on a talk show, and she received a 20-minute standing ovation from the 92nd Street Y audience. But she was banned, essentially, from Brandeis. So we're seeing more of this. Does Harvard have a official position? Is there something there that has been percolating and has had to be submerged by a new president?
Well, first of all, I'm proud of the fact that, at least to date, we've never had a speaker shouted down at Harvard. No, hasn't happened. Last year, Mitch McConnell came and spoke on campus. Betsy DeVos spoke on campus. Charles Murray spoke on campus.
Remember what happened to Charles Murray at Middlebury. Right. He barely got out alive.
And not only did he speak on campus, but when he was all done, he wrote a letter to my predecessor, Drew Faust, saying thank you for the invitation, saying that he had a spirited discussion with students and faculty, and that he was actually proud of his alma mater, because he's a graduate of Harvard. So, can I guarantee you that that will never happen in the future? No. Will I work hard to ensure that we continue that tradition? Absolutely. With respect to microaggressions and other things, what I say to students is our job is to prepare them for the world they will inhabit when they graduate from this place. And that world is not going to treat them with kid gloves just because they went to Harvard. And they may think I have a magic wand which I can wave over the place, which will make everything that's unpleasant in the larger world go away. Take your pick: racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, whatever. And I say, I don't have such a magic wand. And in fact, I can prove it to you, because I challenge you to find any college or university where none of this stuff exists. We're a microcosm of the larger world that we live in. And then I say the following, and this is where I sometimes get in trouble, but I say it anyway. And if I had the magic wand, I wouldn't use it, because we would not do them a favor to put them in an emotional bubble for 4 years and not let their emotional immune systems develop. That they need to learn how to deal with this stuff. Now look, we're not perfect. We should always strive to be better. That's our responsibility, yes. Do I like having these things on campus? Absolutely not. Do I condemn them? You damn straight I do. But that said, the notion that we can protect everybody from everything that's unpleasant, no, I disagree. And we would do students a disservice if we did that. Again, our job is to prepare them for the larger world. And they're going to find all of this stuff when they go out there. I hope they will emerge from Harvard better people, stronger people, better equipped to make the world a better place, a more civil place, one in which they've learned how to speak and engage with people who think differently from them during their 4 years.
I was just about to say, those are wonderful final words, and then this woman raised her hand. So I will grant you the courtesy of giving President Bacow another opportunity to end so winningly.
Wow, with that, I respectfully disagree. I think that universities, you're still dealing with students that are younger. It's not real world because they're 17, 18, 19 years old. I think we're living in a different world where social media is so pervasive, and this generation is really trying to understand that and live through it. And I also think that universities aren't optional as the workplace is. If you're in a workplace and there's microaggressions, you can vote with your feet and leave, or you can speak to human resource and have it dealt with. At university, you're striving to get a degree to go on to something else in your life, and so you have to persevere. If you persevere in an environment where the message from the top is deal with it, then I think you're really at a disadvantage, and it can affect young people's emotional health.
So, look, I don't want to be heard as saying that I just say to people, deal with it. As I said, when things occur on campus that are worthy of condemnation, they get condemned. And we try to create an environment in which everybody can do their best work. But there are limits to what we can do. And I'm not going to make promises to students that I can't keep. And I can't promise them that I'm going to be able to create an environment in which they never feel uncomfortable. In fact, in some ways, part of our job, not in these dimensions, but in other dimensions, is to make them feel uncomfortable, to challenge their beliefs so that they can come to know and understand what they really believe themselves. So it's a fine line that we walk, but I have to say that that we don't do students favors when we create expectations on their part that it is for the university to solve all of their problems for them. Much of what they're dealing with are students behaving badly, in some cases, towards other students. And teaching them how to engage with others and to address those issues is, I think, part of what I hope our students will learn when they're at Harvard.
Still a great way to end and close the night. Please say good night to President Lawrence Bacow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming out for the talk show and other events here at the 92nd Street Y.